Hello, everyone. My name is Miguel Corzo. I'm going to be presenting my final project this evening. I'm going to be doing this right next to my awesome Christmas tree. And let's get started. So, like I said, this is the final project for Psychology 420, Psychology of Learning, here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. We're going to be talking about 3 topics today that I selected out of the list of topics. So first topic is going to be topic 4, classical conditioning basics, topic 5, fear and extinction, and topic 6, operant conditioning basics. So first one, classical conditioning basics. So let's start with what is classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is essentially when you pair 2 stimuluses together in hopes that one stimulus will overcome the other one to cause the response. So that just got a lot of very confusing real quick, right? So we're going to use this picture to explain it, okay? So naturally speaking, food causes, this is what Ivan Pavlov did in his experiment. He noticed that food causes salivation, and he called this an unconditioned stimulus, the food, and a conditioned response, salivation. What his goal was, it was to replace the food to still cause salivation. So what you're doing is grabbing a neutral stimulus, the tuning fork, and hoping that the tuning fork will make the dog salivate. And that would be replacing. So you've conditioned that tuning fork to cause a reaction similar or exactly like the unconditioned response, and that then becomes a conditioned response. So food causes salivation, picture 1, before conditioning. Tuning fork does not cause salivation, that's picture 2, before conditioning. During conditioning, you're pairing the 2 stimuluses together. There are 4 different ways to pair, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide. So tuning fork and food, and he's getting salivated, and then, or he's salivating, and then your goal is in hopes that the tuning fork will cause salivation, and that then is when the tuning fork became the conditioned stimulus, and the dog is salivating, being the conditioned response. So how do we do these 4 different pairing methods? So there's trace, delay, simultaneous, and backwards. So trace essentially is when you bring out the tuning fork first and you play it, it would end, and then once it has ended, you will shortly bring out the food and causing the dog to salivate. Eventually, over time, the dog will actually be able to identify that the tuning fork, once it plays, it means that shortly afterwards, food would be there, and he should start salivating right now because he knows food is coming, right? So the delay conditioning, okay, is when these 2 stimuluses actually overlap for a period of time. So you're going to hit the tuning fork and play, and once you're hitting the tuning fork, you're actually going to bring out the food while it's still ringing, and then the tuning fork will end, and you still have the food and the dog will be salivating. So almost similar effect to trace, but rather than having the neutral stimulus end, you're going to actually have them overlap a little bit. And so simultaneous conditioning procedures is exactly what it sounds like. You're going to be presenting both stimuluses at the same time. And backwards conditioning procedure is when you're actually going to bring out the food first, right? And then you're going to bring the tuning fork afterwards, right? So it's backwards. Both simultaneously and backwards aren't very effective, and I would say that this is probably not very effective because the dog will still associate it to food before the tuning fork, because the food is still a stronger stimulus than those 2. So all of these examples required the dog to recognize that there was a stimulus that was going to happen before the food. So a lot of people say, hey, he needs to know that the tuning fork means food, right? So do you need to be aware for conditioning to occur? No, you don't. This is the reason why. Conditioning sometimes occur without awareness, so that the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are related. Okay? So Kenneth Devin did an experiment. His experiment was pretty much presenting a bunch of words to certain people, and then the word barn would come out. And when the word barn comes out, he would just shock them. Okay? But other people observed this. Okay? Now, other people, without even knowing when the word barn came out, had the same response. And so this was done unconsciously. Another example of why awareness or consciousness does not need to be a part of this. There are animals with actual limited ability of thinking and processing that still respond to classical conditioning. One of them would be worms. Worms essentially almost do not have brains, but you can condition them to respond a certain way after a while. So, interesting little fact. So, we're going to talk about the next topic, fear and extinction. Okay? So, fear. One of the best experiments to pretty much train someone with fear was Watson's Little Albert experiment, as we all know it. So in 1920, John B. Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner at Johns Hopkins University conducted the famous Little Albert experiment. Okay, let's talk about what the Little Albert experiment was. So they picked a baby who had very little affect to fear. Right? He didn't actually show very much fear to anything. And babies, because they don't know any better, especially little Albert, didn't respond to anything that would be scary. So you see him there with the scary clown mask right there. You would bring him out a little rat, he wouldn't be scared. You would do a lot of things and he would be just okay. And so Watson's goal was the belief that he can train a child to be afraid of something. And he did this through classical conditioning, right? So he would bring out the little rat and he would be okay. But one thing that did startle little Albert was a random loud noise just happening right behind him. So what he ended up doing, whenever the little rat was there and he would touch the little rat, he would just make this loud noise right behind the baby, startling him and making him fear and be afraid. So what ended up happening was that he would actually start crying. And so he conditioned little Albert to be afraid of the rat. So just to reiterate, now whenever that little rat was around, little Albert would start screaming and crying, and it actually expanded to not only being afraid of the rat, but anything that was furry. So that was the little Albert experiment. Now, as you can very well see in there, can you say ethics problem? The reason we're saying that there was a major ethics, I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on, but here's the big one. Albert's conditioning was never reversed. So, did Albert grow up with just being afraid of everything that had fur? Or was he just afraid for the rest of his life of rats or this fear without even knowing where he even got it? More than likely, according to theory, the actual condition will extinguish because there was nothing to reinforce it after a while. And then over time, he will actually start, the theory would be that he would actually start developing new natural conditioning that would actually train him to respond otherwise and things like that. So that conditioning would be replaced over time naturally. But what should have been done ethically, and this is how I would do it, is our text discusses the Mary Cover Jones counter conditioning. And so there's many ways of counter conditioning. There's in vivo, there's virtual, there's different methods of counter conditioning. And what counter conditioning essentially is doing the same process, but rather than putting a negative, trying to associate that conditioned stimulus, that in this case the rat, to being afraid or have that response, you're going to actually try to move that rat to actually a positive response. So you're going to be replacing in that original conditioning. So the way I would originally do this is I would probably get some candy, because most kids like candy a lot, right? So naturally, when I show the rat, he'll be afraid and start crying and stuff like that. But whenever the rat would come by, I would actually give him a little bit of candy. And as time goes by, he'll start associating the rat to something good, something nice, right? And so if he touches the rat, I'll give him a full bar of candy. And this is called in vivo exposure therapy, right? Letting them know that whenever something's around, that it's not that bad, that it's not bad, right? And this is what I would do. So we're going to talk about topic 6, operant conditioning, right? We talked about a little bit of operant conditioning, or like tried to touch on it when we were talking about in vivo. So what's the difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning? So major differences is that classical conditioning is an involuntary response to a stimulus. Operant conditioning is a voluntary behavior to consequences. Okay, I'm voluntarily being, based off of my experience, doing this action, because that experience will either reward me or punish me. Okay, let's go on to the next point. There are no rewards needed for classical conditioning. So for the behavior or the natural responses you get, you're not being rewarded or punished for it. You just naturally do it. Now, operant conditioning is either strengthened or weakened the behavior. So as you reward something, you are increasing and strengthening that behavior. As you punish something, you are lessening and weakening that behavior. So rewards and punishments are needed for that. So in classical conditioning, it is a passive part of learning, okay? Passive part, okay? Meaning there's very little to influence it, not even thoughts. It's just a lot of natural occurrence, right? With operant conditioning, it is an active, you have active participation. And so you are an active participant and act in order to be rewarded or punished. So I was saying before, when there is a behavior you want to occur, you are actively making that decision to do that behavior because you know what you're going to get, right? Or what you're not going to get. So I'm actively doing this project, right? Because I do not want to be punished and be given a bad grade, right? For classical conditioning, an association of the two stimuluses of some sort of already naturally occurring event has to happen. So there has to be an association of some sort already occurring for classical conditioning to work. For operant conditioning, behavior can be rewarded or punished. Okay? So what this is saying is that this is already a naturally occurring act. That behavior is gonna happen, right? So you're now just associating that behavior so that it can repeat with something else. The dog is gonna salivate when there's food, right? He does not making that choice. what you are doing is you are actually just trying to associate that behavior to another object, something or another stimulus, something else. But the act of salivating is not, you're not doing it on purpose for something. Now, operant conditioning, the dog will now with operant conditioning, if you see the dog sitting to teach sit, right? The dog will be sitting so that it can actually receive a reward, good dog, a treat, or something else. Or the dog will actually go potty training so that you can actually reward it by positive reinforcement, saying good dog, or giving him a treat for actually going outside, right? Or to avoid punishment. There are people who get very upset when their dogs poop inside and be like, "Ah, you little rascal." Never, I do not condone hitting animals. So for those of you that think that punishment requires you to hit an animal, that is wrong. So let's talk about the law of effect a little. This is the main thing that I'm sorry, excuse me. This is the main thing that influences the operant conditioning, right? So like you see right there, the law of effect means that what you do has consequences, right? When you do something, right, it will have natural consequences. It will have an effect. You will observe or experience this effect. Sorry, I'm too far in this video to stop and do this again, so please excuse me. So, as I was saying, now, these effects will either positively reinforce or negatively reinforce. I'm going to use fire, for instance, right? Or better yet, I'm going to use cleaning my room, right? Because this was the same experience I had when I was in the military. So, as you can very well see, I just got off of work not that long ago. I'm wearing my uniform. I don't know how well you can see that. I'm wearing my tan shirt and making this video because I know I need to, right? So, in the military, we get people from all over the country, sometimes different parts of the world, to join our military. This is done. So, as you can very well tell, there are like some issues that could come with this. People from different parts of the country, even different parts of the world, have different cultures, beliefs, things like that, which at times causes conflict and some heads to butt. So, drill sergeants and stuff like that have a tough job ahead of them to try to teach people to work together collectively in a team. They do this through operant conditioning, actually, believe it or not. So what they end up doing is they give us our instructions. Hey, these are the standards you need to abide by. The example I'm going to use is make your bed a certain way. There's hospital corners you need to do. It needs to be nice and tight, pressed. Your pillow needs to be a certain way. Your blankets need to be folded a certain way. Your rack needs to be sorted a certain way, and it needs to be uniform across every single bunk. Top, bottom, all 120 people in the company need to be the same. This is done through positive or negative reinforcement. So, while growing up, I was never a big person about making my bed. And needless to say, I had difficulties with wanting to follow this rule when I was in basic training. So what the drill sergeants ended up doing is that they would come by and be like regular drill sergeants. They would grab my bunk, throw it all over the place, grab my clothes and everything else, toss it up in the air, destroy my neighbors and every other bed in the area because I did not make a hospital corner the right way at a 45-degree angle. It was a 25-degree angle. So after all of that, I went, and I made it again. They came in, they grabbed everybody, and we went out, and we were like working out for 2 hours straight. They called it a dirt pit, and it was a rainy day, so that dirt and rain means mud all over you. You're rolling, doing push-ups, dropping, sit-ups, jumping, all kinds of crazy stuff, right? Turns out to be that punishment was because one side wasn't tucked in all the way and a little end came out. So they did this a lot through negative punishment. Uh, Needless to say, after so long of it, I consciously started making that behavior of making my bed perfectly and inspecting it every single time before I left. And actually, it is a behavior that's actually stuck with me ever since, for 11 years now. When I first wake up in the morning, I make that bed, and it is a pretty nice looking bed. So, another way the military does this is that when you are actually being trained on something, they actually give you positive reinforcement. They give you praises, awards, treatments, let you know that you are actually being recognized because you are exceeding or doing the standard. And also they give you personal time, things like that. So the military practices this law of effect and operant conditioning. So as you can very well tell in the picture, don't make your bed right. Nothing bad happens if you brush your teeth or you avoid the casualties, right? So, or the cavities. So you do your bed right. So if you do your bed right, you're going to get something good. You're not going to get your stuff tossed out, right? But if you don't do your bed right, you're going to go outside and you're going to be on the dirt pit for a while. Okay? So positive reinforcement will means you're actually trying to increase a behavior. Negative reinforcement means you're actually trying to decrease a behavior. So rewarding behavior usually leads to the repetition of that behavior. So, and punishing behavior leads to reduction of the behavior. Hopefully that makes a clear picture between classical conditioning and what the law of effect is. So you do something, there's something that's going to follow it. Essentially, that's what the law of effect is. So that's the end of my presentation. And I would like to thank everybody. And I have finally done with this. This is my last project for the year. And on to my next and last semester with you guys here at UNLV. So hopefully I get to see some of you guys again next semester. Here are my references, the textbook, and have a great evening.